So I have had these ideas sort of fermenting for a while as regards how the Scottish folk scene particularly archives itself. I'm a collector of records and all kinds of formats of audio to do with Scottish traditional music. Just fell into it collecting Corey's records as a teenager and haven't stopped. And so the alternative title for this is How I Get My House Back. Uh, but in all seriousness, what has become clear in recent years through multiple conversations in different directions is looking at how archiving outside of the academic setting plays a role for traditional music. We're all aware of places like the School of Scottish Studies and the Elphinstone and so forth that have great archives of fieldwork material, but in my view, there isn't really a comprehensive archive of the folk scene, and I use that in the most broadest of terms, really from the revival through to the present day. So this really kind of started to multiply my thoughts a little bit during the lockdown. I had occasion to reorganize some of my collection, and it just started me thinking about formats. I've also been involved a couple of years ago with a thing called Connecting Scotland Sounds, which was a National Library of Scotland initiative for their Scotland Sounds project, which is really looking to develop a national sound archive portal for Scotland. And we had to come up with different items for a handling box to take into schools and sharing different technologies with kids, which was really hilarious at times. But I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the formats that I'm specifically referring to with regard to what a Scottish traditional music archive might do. And that's really coming from sort of the 60s through to the present day, thinking of LP, cassette, DAT, CD, CDR, download and streaming, and mini disc. And these are all the main formats that are really amongst my own collection. Just going to speak very quickly about some of the problems with each of these. Some of you will be familiar with it, but generally from a more specialist point of view, LPs are generally stable, but the issue we have in the trad music scene is that some releases have never made it to digital format. Cassette, massive format for home and commercial releases. It's somewhat more at risk, and some releases again have never made it to digital. DAT, digital audio tape, is something to my cost, which I'll show you in a couple of slides. Caused a bit of a problem last year when we were looking for some Malinky archive material to go onto our 20th anniversary album. This has actually been used for lots of album masters into the late 1990s and early 2000s. And it's also been used for some field work. When I trained to be a field worker at the School of Scottish Studies, it was DAT tape in the mid-90s. That's now been abandoned because the format is unstable. I got one of the masters for the Malinky album, the first Malinky album from Green Tracks Recordings, and it was on DAT. Needless to say, I actually used the CD because of the quality issues. So that's at risk in amongst record labels. CDs are generally in reasonable condition, but some pressing plants have a vulnerability to what they call disc rot or crazing, and I'll show you that in a second on a slide. CDR in the trad music world, Byrne CDs, they're also produced in small runs by factories with multiple burners, often for specialist releases. If you're looking at a particular singer, there's a label called Musical Traditions that puts out people like Lizzie Higgins, Daisy Chapman, Joe Ray, people that wouldn't normally warrant a conventional commercial release. That's vulnerable to degradation, and I found some of that amongst my collection. Download and streaming, there's not really any comprehensive collecting being done. And then mini disc I've appended on here, not really because it was used much in the commercial sense, but lots of performances and rehearsals, certainly in Malinky and many other bands I'm aware of. People would have recorded rehearsals and one-off gigs and things in the 90s and 2000s. It's a pretty stable format, it's well protected, but the problem now is the availability of reliable players. So that's a lot of the sort of technical observations. This is a CD from 2006 from my friends in the band Freebo. I took this out of my collection when I was reorganizing it during lockdown, and it has this, it's quite hard to photograph because the camera wants to photograph the reflection, but this has got crazing on it that is making it unplayable. And you may not be able to see, but in the top right image there, the clue, if you know about these things, is actually in the name of the plant that has produced the CD, EDC Blackburn. Unfortunately, the Blackburn plant producing CDs is a bit notorious for having a problem with its polymers, and over time CDs have begun to degrade. This CD is from 2006, but the more common thing you might see is this kind of sort of burnishing on the edges that is basically the polymer starting to break down. And this is a disc from 1992. So CD is not as invincible as we might think. For short releases, I was talking about Sleepy Town Records. They've put out lots of bothy singer releases, but you see the silver top and the blue underside. So I'll just flip back there. The blue underside, that gives the giveaway that it's a CDR. So may only have a lifespan somewhere around 20 years. It really depends on the manufacturer and you know, the estimates that they've put on their product. So that's an at-risk format. This was the DAT tape that I had to take apart and splice, basically like the old days in the studio, and put onto another DAT shell to get it to play. So I guess what I'm saying in the grand scheme of things is that there are lots of formats that we've maybe taken for granted were fairly secure. Actually, 20 years down the line into my career as a musician and performer, it's just not the case. So you might think there's other people out there doing that. Well, to an extent, you'd be right. And one format I've not mentioned is 78s or shellacs. Last year, this gentleman in the check shirt, Bill Dean Myatt, donated the remainder of his collection to the National Library of Scotland, and that's Ali Bell, the sound curator at the National Library. As part of his studies and as a mature student, he put together a thing called a Scottish Vernacular Discography, and you can get a version of that on the National Library website. And if anybody's ever raking around looking for a Harry Lauder track or Harry Gordon or any of those performers, you can almost certainly find a record of it there. He's gone through all of the labels, Beltona, Zonophone, all of these folk, and actually has it right down to information on when it was recorded, who played the piano, all that sort of thing. So that base is kind of covered as regards trad music or vernacular music up until the middle of the 20th century. The National Library does collect other material, but I'm exactly sure how comprehensive it is or how targeted it is in terms of traditional music. Just to say what Bill Dean Myatt says, he feels it's important for Scotland to have its own national sound archive and collect its own vernacular music. And we'll hope that his collection would form a bit of a debate, really, to encourage other people to donate. Quickly then, the issues surrounding the folk scene in its broadest terms. There's a wide variety of labels, including self-releases now. To my knowledge, few labels actually have a legacy plan. Some labels are defunct and the releases never made it to digital. Availability of certain material is actually quite hard. I went raking yesterday to find a complete set of the Lynn Records Byrne's material, and I can't get it on CD. I would have to buy it on download. Even some Malinky albums are out of print. By association, there's a loss of access to research or source materials for emerging performers. There are private collections of recordings needing a home. Specifically, I see that Edna Wilson's here from Scots Music Group. When I worked there, we discovered when we moved office up in the belfry of the church that we were based in were hundreds of CDs and a couple of hundred vinyls and some mini discs that Ian McLennan, who died far too young, about 18 years ago now, he was a Scots Music Group enthusiast and also Edinburgh Folk Club on the board and all sorts of things. Massive collection that he's left, and unfortunately it's just lain in abeyance at Scots Music Group other than a light cataloguing, because we've had no place to put it, to be honest. The original idea was that people would come into the office and use it as a kind of library for learning tunes or whatever, but it just hasn't come to pass. Sadly, to you know, can't get away from it, in the last few years we've lost a few performers of note who undoubtedly would have had their own collections of folk related material, recorded material, books, etc. That's something to think about. And there's no thing for commercial output of Scottish traditional music as legal deposit, which is basically most publishers are supposed to send a copy of a new item to the copyright libraries around the UK and Ireland, and in Scotland that's the National Library. A quick whiz through some of the labels that I've pulled from my collection and knowledge. It's not exhaustive, but you're going from broadcaster labels like BBC and Grampian. There's more modern labels like Foot Stompin', McNyanama. There's Sleepy Town doing the one-off prints. Springtime's a notable exception. Pete Shepherd has donated a lot of his archive to the National Library. But then there's labels like Green Linnet, which is now defunct. Green Tracks and Temple, both Ian Green and Robin Morton are in their 80s. I think Ian will be 87 in January. And then a few others that are not on the go. There's also some major labels that released vinyl in the 60s and 70s, even right down to, you know, peculiar labels, peculiar performers who never really made more than one or two albums. Even a local performer here in Trent, was on an EMI record. Sorry, that should say Fontana, not Fontanta. Things that never made it to digital. Lismore Folk Andy Hunter, the Hamish Henderson album in 1992 that went with A Journey to a Kingdom, and then some of these young folk albums with the likes of Gene Redpath, Tom Anderson. A quick scoot through some of my collection just to give you an idea what I'm talking about. This is an American release, folk song and music from the Berryfields of Blair. Dundee Strathspey and Real Society is a self-release. Alexander Brothers, that's a Canadian release. This is a fishing song project album from Kettle Records, Singing Kettle. This is Davy Steele's first album. Has anybody got that? The McCalmans, when their new lineup started, this is on their own label. And then lots of 7-inch releases, actually. These are much more common than people realize. That had often, it was kind of an EP, excuse me. And there's many of these of all sorts, including some of the well-known tradition bearers. And you may also have bought this as your first record if you were in my family. So yeah, Donny MacLeod. This has interfaced a bit with something that Stuart Aidman has been thinking about. Stuart from the Whistle Binkies is also involved a lot with looking at contemporary practice and the kind of instruments that we use. And he's interested in particular in the age of the compact cassette. I probably don't have time to read all of this today, but you can look it back on the recording. But it's really the idea that the compact cassette heralded a shift in the mid to late 20th century in the way that people used music, and that there is really a highly significant resource out there to do with the progress of Scotland's music, and it's relatively under-researched. There's much recorded material of extra musical interest, including off-air recordings, dubs of rare or missing master tapes, journal entries, school classroom recordings, etc. And he thinks we should really act now, because many of these people are still with us, that could inform or give us information on the material. So, all that said, look across the water. In Ireland, artistic research is an important and ongoing element of traditional artists' creative work, and the Arts Council supports this through strategic funding investment in archival resources and archival recording of contemporary practice. High value placed within the traditional arts on transmission and the acknowledgement of source, and so forth. The Irish Traditional Music Archive started, that's me on my visit there last year, started as a pilot project by the Irish Arts Council in 1987. It now gets €620,000 a year from the Arts Council in Ireland and a small contribution from the Arts Council in Northern Ireland. The building comes from the state via the Office of Public Works, project funding from Heritage Council and Cultural Ireland, and is currently in the middle of a nearly €200,000 European Commission project for digital research. So if it can happen in Ireland, why not here? The proposal, Scottish Traditional Music Archive, some of the things it could do. It would aim to collect primarily commercial recordings in the first instance from the mid-20th century onwards. It would establish a folk trad discography, building on work that Dave Francis has begun, incorporating collections like the Ian McLennan Archive. Wouldn't primarily deal with older fieldwork type material or wax cylinder, shellac, reel-to-reel, but it could signpost to other archives as that material comes up. It would request copies of all new folk or trad releases in various formats. It could accept off-air material, rehearsals, amateur recordings, provide a route for people to donate recordings and collections, and identify and safeguard any that become available and signposting to appropriate archives. It could expand in the fullness of time to include printed material such as books, sheet music, folk publications, living tradition, ephemera, posters, etc. Could include audiovisual materials such as folk programs from radio and TV broadcasters. There is a dearth of access out there. I have some stuff from the 90s on VHS that I can't even find records of in the BBC archives, and it's by some quite big names in the folk scene. It would contact folk labels to assess their legacy plans. It would engage with other projects and cataloguers such as Stuart Aidman and the late Derek Hoy's Rare Tunes, Nigel Gatherer's Musical Museum, which is a brilliant discography and who's who of the folk scene up to a certain point. And a great website from Germany you've maybe come across, mainlynorfolk.info. There's a real sort of Anorak fan who's a lovely guy in Germany that buys folk albums and puts the information of them up on his website. It would have to develop a digitization and preservation strategy, either in-house or with a partner such as the Scottish Music Centre, the National Library of Scotland. engage with national bodies and Scottish Government, such as NLS, British Library, ITMA, to establish a longer-term strategy. Would develop a programme of public awareness raising and solicit donations of material, and would issue publications. Final slide, really. How is it funded? This is for the discussion. Is it a building or an agency? Is it both? Is it a subsection of another body? What are the obstacles? Why should we not have one? And can it provide alternative opportunities for trad performers? That's fitting in with what we talked about earlier in terms of alternative routes of employment, etc. What can we do to build the case in the short term? And can we have your records? Thanks.